A hugely up and down weekend for a lot of the teams on the grid, with some really good performances in the sprint but poor performances in the race. Good sprint qualifying performances paired with poor race qualifying performances. But which team got the better of it? I don't really know. Obviously, Red Bull coming away with a very, very easy win in both the sprint and the race. Now, a car with that advantage should be winning every race. To be honest with you, for me, they should be getting 1-2 every race, but I don't think Perez is a strong enough driver. But we'll get into that later down the line. We're going to start off with talking about Alpine. Obviously, they brought some upgrades to their car this weekend. Obviously, mainly for Esteban Ocon, which meant that he had a lighter car, a better performing car than Pierre Gasly. I believe Gasly will get them in Miami, which is the next race. I think it's in a couple of weeks. Actually, I believe it's on my birthday weekend. So, like, in between May 3rd and May 6th. I'm not quite sure what the weekend dates are. But for me, looked like a really big improvement in the right direction. Ocon and Gasly both got into Q2, qualifying 13th and 15th for the main race. And they were 13th and 15th in the sprint. Good performances in those qualifying sessions for me. They should be really happy with the improvements they've made with them upgrades. Obviously, Gasly hasn't seen them yet. Will he be ahead in the next race? Will the upgrades transfer over to Miami? Who knows? Obviously, we know how difficult these cars are to get things right. If you have not done so already and you are enjoying this Formula 1 content, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below or in this top corner. Obviously, in the race, there was a lot of drama, a lot happened, a couple of safety cars and engine failure, a couple of crashes. But Ocon and Gasly found their way through all that, finishing 11th and 13th in the race. Obviously, some penalties helped them out a little bit, some DNFs helped them out, safety cars, etc. But for me, to be honest with you, I think they've got a point. If it wasn't for the safety cars, Ocon was looking really good. But I think they can be really happy with the improvements they've made, the direction they're going in. Obviously, it's the right way. They're going forwards, not backwards. Once Gasly gets the upgrade, we can see a full proper comparison between the two drivers. But until then, it's a bit hard to say. I think Gasly did really well with the package he had. Obviously, the heavier package, the slower package, but he still found himself 15th for the sprint and qualifying, and then 13th in the race, which I think really good performance. Now, getting on to Sauber, obviously Guan Yu Zhou's first home race ever, could be probably his only home race, depending on what happens over the coming season. Obviously, there is a world where he doesn't have a contract for next season, which I'm not going to say he deserves a contract, but I think he's shown quality, he just hasn't had the package beneath him, which is obviously disappointing for a driver, but it's just one of those things that happens, and it's just something he's got to find a way to earn himself a contract, really. And I thought he had a good performance personally. A few issues along the way led to worse finishing positions than he probably deserves, but it's just one of those things. Obviously, in the sprint, Guan Yu Zhou finished P9, Bottas P12. Qualifying, Guan Yu Zhou had a similar mistake to Lewis Hamilton. He was out in Q1. Bottas got himself to Q3. Obviously, the day before for the sprint, both drivers got into Q3 for that. In the race, Valtteri Bottas DNF'd. Engine failure. Are Ferrari going to be worried about that? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know the full story on why the engine cut out, why it failed and things like that. Now, Guan Yu Zhou finished P14. Couple of slow stops. Bit of a typical weekend for Sauber, really. It's one of those things. Obviously, Gasly, if you didn't know, had his issue in his pit stop for the Alpine, where one of his wheels wasn't on properly and hit a mechanic. I believe the mechanic has, is all okay, but I'm not 100% sure about that, so don't quote me. But obviously, back to Sauber. Bottas's DNF. We've got to have a bit of a conversation about this, because he was out the car putting his steering wheel back on, and cars were still essentially racing at full racing speed. It was just double waved yellows, and for me, that has to be a straight, he's gone off at heavy braking zone. For me, I think it should be a straight VSC at minimum, if not straight into a safety car, because if someone locks up, goes down, and Bottas is out the car putting the steering wheel on, it's curtains. Legs could be gone. It's very, very dangerous. And we saw what happened with Jules Bianchi when he goes into the tractor and what happened there. And we saw what year was it when I think it was in Japan, and there was a a tractor on track and nobody knew there was a tractor on track going to repair some hoardings, and it's things that the FIA need to get better at for me, and it's very disappointing to see that they're still, realistically, although safety is being put first when it comes to what's on the cars, although safety is being put forward and the main thing for what happens with the cars and what's on the cars, it's still not quite the same for when there's a crash on track or things like that. Like, why are you doing this? Like, things like that. And it's obviously very, very difficult. Obviously, we all know what happened with Bianchi. We know what's happened with some other drivers over the past few years. And it's difficult to see things like this, especially with the situations we've had recently. And hopefully they can rectify that situation. I'm sure they probably won't say a word about it, but it's just something which I noted, which I think needs looking into and needs sorting. Obviously, we'll get on to Williams now. Albon and Sargeant seem to really struggle in the sprint, 17 and 18. A few changes heading into qualifying. 14th and 20th for the race. Obviously, Albon ahead. What else could be expected, really? I believe Sargeant made a mistake on his lap. I think he spun, which meant, obviously, he couldn't improve. Then they finished 12th and 17th in the race. Sargeant, I believe, got a penalty for a safety car infringement, which obviously ended up with him in 17th. Him and, I believe it was Magnusen, had a really good battle at one point. Obviously, Magnusen got into all sorts of trouble during this race. Wasn't a great weekend all round for Williams. Never really seemed to get on top of the car. Obviously, Alex will be buzzing with, well, will he be buzzing with P12? I think they'll be happy with P12, but without the DNFs, obviously, they'd be much further back. It's just one of those situations where I don't really think they got on top of the car this weekend, and I think the situation with Williams is they've tried to go for a more balanced car and they've lost out on some of the performance benefits that they had with their previous iteration of car. Obviously, Haas have made huge strides this season. Sauber not necessarily making huge strides when it comes to pit stops, but like they've put some really good performances on despite that, and it's just one of those situations. Obviously, Racing Bulls have made a step forward as well, and it's just one of those really where Williams don't seem to have gone forward, don't seem to have gone backwards. They've made their car better as a whole, but they've lost some of their major strengths that they had, if that made sense, in the way of getting some of their weaknesses better. And don't get me wrong, I think Vowles is taking Williams in the right direction, but they're just a long way from where they need to be. And obviously, with the cost cap and the development restrictions that we have, which I'm going to get onto at the end of this video, because I think really it's hamstringing every team from being able to do what it needs to do. And I think we're supposed, like, F1 is supposed to be like the greatest engineering motorsport in the world, and we're at the point where you can't even do certain things because you can't spend the money or you haven't got the development area, and it's really hard to find performance gains when you've not got the chance for trial and error. And I think a big thing in engineering, in strategy, in racing, and like all sports, it's trial and error. You have to spend money to like make things better. It's just the way the world is. And I think, like, you look at someone buying a home, if you don't spend money on the house, it's not going to get better, it's just going to get worse. And with the teams being limited on what they can spend and stuff like that, I just think it's difficult to see anyone really ever being able to challenge someone from, if someone has a massive advantage from the jump, you're never going to be able to challenge them, and that's what we're seeing on track. Obviously, Racing Bulls, for me, I thought Ricciardo had a really good weekend. Obviously in the sprint race, finishing P11, Tsunoda P16. Tsunoda seemed a bit out of sorts. I'm not sure if they swapped chassis or if Ricciardo's got a new chassis. I know that was something which was discussed in between races, but Tsunoda seemed to have no real pace, didn't seem to really be anywhere. Obviously in the race he was doing all right up until he got hit, but sprint race P11 and P16, Ricciardo 11, Tsunoda 16. Qualifying Ricciardo 12, Tsunoda 19, and then double DNF in their race. No fault of their own for either driver. Ricciardo was rear-ended by Lance Stroll under safety car, in what was a really sort of weird incident. Obviously, Verstappen goes and then slows right down on the corner, which then has a concertina effect, or whatever it's called, all the way back up the grid. Alonso had to slam on his brakes, Sainz, Leclerc, all the way back sort of thing. And then you've sort of got that problem where Ricciardo's sort of slowing down for the car in front. Lance Stroll can't slow that, like, is focused on the apex because he wants to get going. And it's just one of those things where they clash. Obviously, nothing Ricciardo could do. Tsunoda got spun by a Haas on the safety car restart. Puncher on the grass, couldn't get it back to the pits at the race. Obviously, K-Mag was in a lot of action this weekend, so we'll get on to Haas. I think they had pace. They were in some really good positions at times, but I think they struggled in the pits. Not in the pits, in the sprint. Well, Hulkenberg did anyway. But K-Mag finished P10. Qualifying, obviously, again, Nico Hulkenberg pulling out some amazing qualifying laps. I honestly don't know where he gets it from sometimes. He's just got this way of dragging a car around a lap. He hasn't quite got the same in race trim, though, in my opinion, where he can just drag a car where it shouldn't be. Obviously, finishing P9 in the race. Was it P9, P10, whatever, in the race? Yeah, P10, I think it was, yeah. K-Mag ruined his own race, but was in a really good position before then. Taking Tsunoda out. K-Mag is just that driver that just is there because he's got experience and he can drive, but he just has these moments where he just forgets what he's supposed to be doing. Doesn't like to give up position, doesn't like to sort of think of the long term, just thinks of, oh, I'm not letting him past, or oh, I'm getting past him now. Like the collision with Tsunoda came from like a massively late lunge, and realistically it was a Max Verstappen type move that shouldn't be happening in motorsport, any sense of the imagination. It was never on, the gap was never there, but he thought it was. Make connection, Tsunoda's out, and Haas will look into it, but they're not really going to say much. K-Mag obviously got himself a penalty, ended up right down at the bottom. Disappointing, but that's just the way life is. Mercedes then, both drivers, ups and downs. Obviously, Hamilton having all the joy on Saturday, like Friday evening and Saturday, with the front row in the sprint shootout, and then finishing P2, and ultimately led that sprint race for 9-10 laps and put the Mercedes in a really good position. Now, obviously, don't get me wrong, benefited massively from the squabbles that were going on behind him and them not being able to catch up, but he put in some really good laps to keep that car out of DRS range of Fernando Alonso, and then Alonso put in a really good defensive performance to keep the rest behind. But once Verstappen got up behind Alonso into DRS and he sorted out his battery, which wasn't working for like the first lap and a half, it was sort of curtains really. Once he got past Alonso, it was sort of inevitable. Now, obviously, Hamilton did make that lock up into, was it turn 14, turn 15, the hairpin before you get onto the back straight, and obviously, Hamilton will probably be disappointed with that, but it just seemed to be a characteristic of the car this weekend. Made a few mistakes into that hairpin, especially going into qualifying. George Russell obviously finished P8 in the sprint. Didn't really make any inroads, and it was very similar for the race. Obviously, in quali, Lewis went a bit extreme on the setup, trying to chase some extra performance, trying to reduce lock-in, heading into that hairpin that he locked up in the sprint, and then he locks up into the hairpin in qualifying when he was on a lap, which I believe was on course for P5 in Q1. Now, obviously, that had put him through quite easily, and would he have gone out in Q2? Probably. Like, the car's on a knife edge, and for me, Mercedes are in real problem. Like, they have real problems for me. Lewis ended up P18, and can't really complain about the P18. It was as much his own fault as it was the car's. The car could have got into Q3. I've said it like a million times before. Like, the top 10, those cars should be Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes, Aston Martin every week. Every race weekend, sorry. That's what it should be, because like the gap between those cars and the ones behind, it's insane really. George ended up qualifying P8 in the end. Race pace wise, Lewis was nowhere. Neither was George really. Never really seemed to make any inroads. Both drivers made up positions. Obviously, Lewis going from P18 to P9 in the end. So ended up picking up some points, but realistically, another disappointing performance for Mercedes. George Russell ended up, I think it was P6 in the end. He was lucky to get that P6 because of Fernando Alonso's strategy. We'll get onto that in a minute. But for me, for Mercedes, there's got to be questions asked of Toto Wolff now. Obviously, we've been going through this at Mercedes for, the past 3 years. Started off with a concept which was dodgy, didn't change the concept, had a dodgy car last year, but at least the car was consistent. And then, ultimately, they've changed it again. And people say, oh, well, it's Lewis Hamilton's say, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, all we publicly know that they've changed for Lewis Hamilton is the steering rack and the seating position, which don't offer a performance benefit. Like, it's a confidence thing rather than a performance thing, and that's what some people need to understand. This isn't a car designed and built by Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton isn't a car designer. He isn't the aerodynamicist. If he was, he'd be getting paid a lot more money than he is, and he'd be doing a lot more than he is. But even when he's trying to help the team, they don't want it. And like, some of the things which Toto has said over this weekend, for me, just shows why Lewis has made the perfect decision to go to Ferrari. Some stupid things Toto has said, and if you want to go and find them, they're on Twitter, Facebook, whatever your platform of social media is, you'll be able to go and find them. But it just shows Toto Wolff is that ex that's still hung up on you, doesn't want to give you the benefit of the doubt. And the way he spoke after the sprint race to Sky Germany, for me, just, it's not on, especially to a driver like Lewis Hamilton who put in such an amazing performance. And it's just one of those things. Now, Lewis Hamilton obviously must have a crystal ball. We saw him with his move to Mercedes from McLaren, jumping from one of the best teams to the 5th fastest team at the time, and we saw how that worked out. And then obviously Ferrari again, faster than Mercedes this weekend, have been faster all season, and ultimately were faster at the back end of last season, and they were able to keep up there with the McLarens and the Red Bulls. Obviously not able to put a real fight on for the podium, but just one of those things. Ferrari looking good. Lewis Hamilton looks to have made a great decision. Aston Martin, Stroll is Stroll. Not really much to say on Lance Stroll. 14th in the sprint. No real pace for him. Fernando Alonso was putting in a really good performance. Got clipped in a battle with Carlos Sainz for 3rd place. Ended up with a puncher. Ended up retiring. And then he ended up, I believe, with a 10-second penalty. Penalty which I don't particularly agree with, but it's just one of those things. We keep moving, really. Then for the race, Stroll qualified P11, Alonso P3. Again, I still think Stroll should be in Q3. I think Hamilton should be in Q3. I think most people agree with that in the long term. Alonso's race was destroyed by the safety car. It just put on a soft tyre. And it sort of ruined his race, really. But a late charge on heavily offset mediums. I think he had something like 20 lap offset to some cars, and got himself up to P7 in the end. I think at times he was lapping 3 or 4 seconds quicker than anybody else on the track. If he had more laps, he'd have probably ended up getting George Russell and maybe Carlos Sainz as well. But finishing P7 in the end. Stroll rear-ended Ricciardo, ended up with a penalty and damage. All under safety car, by the way. I spoke about it earlier when we was talking about Ricciardo. Got himself a penalty, ended up P15. Not worst case scenario, but again, he's got to be doing better for me. And I think that's one of the most wasted seats in Formula 1 right now. And something has got to change at Aston Martin, but it won't be Lance Stroll. Like, we all know that. If we get on to McLaren, obviously, I think Piastri's still struggling with tyres. Just doesn't seem to sort of have the same handle on them as Lando Norris does. Obviously, comes with experience and time. He'll get there in the end, but he's not quite showing what I expected him to show this season, and it's disappointing because I thought he was brilliant at parts during last season. I thought he could really take a step forward this season, but we've not quite seen that yet. Obviously, in the sprint race, Lando Norris had qualified on pole position, makes a huge error into turn 1, going wide. People claim it was Lewis's fault. Had absolutely nothing to do with Lewis. He was already going wide before Lewis had his snap. But ended up P6, couldn't really recover, couldn't really show anything. I think it just shows the problem that these cars have. In dirty air, you just can't find any pace. Tyres die, and you're just nowhere really. It's like Lewis Hamilton couldn't even make inroads on Esteban Ocon at points, and it's disappointing to see because the whole point of these cars was to stop this situation and to have it so that the cars could be within a second of each other. But hey ho, Piastri ended up finishing 2 seconds behind Lando, but no real show of pace from either in that sprint race, and it was spent mostly in a train, as I've just mentioned. Qualified P4 and 5 for the main race, Norris ahead. Decent pace from both drivers, decent session. Race-wise, P2 and P8, Norris on the podium. Really good race from Norris. Getting another podium without a win, though. Safety car nailed him onto a one-stop with Leclerc. Norris was able to get the temperature into the tyres and performed really well. In complete honesty, at times was lapping quicker than Sergio Perez, which obviously got him that buffer that he had at the end of the race when he finished. So it's one of those, I think Perez should have done more. I don't think Perez deserves the Red Bull seat, but that's a different discussion. Piastri couldn't keep the pace even before a safety car. Struggled with damage after contact from Ricciardo during the safety car period after Ricciardo was rear-ended. Ended up P8, not terrible, not great, but I think it shows the pace differential. A damaged McLaren kept Lewis Hamilton and the Mercedes couldn't catch up to. So whatever was going off with Mercedes, it's just a big problem. Ferrari 4 and 5 in the sprint, not great pace. Some really good battles in that sprint race between Carlos and Charles. I thought Carlos at times was a bit too much for it being his teammate, if you get what I mean. You can let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Then in quali, Carlos had a spin, I believe it was Q2, hit the wall, got back going. There was a lot of sort of talk about that. Was it allowed? Was it not? Appeal was lodged by Aston Martin, but nothing came of it. Ended up qualifying P7, Carlos Sainz, and then Leclerc P6. Not really where they want to be, but they're still having those issues with tyre warm-up. They both did 2 different types of warm-up, and neither really worked. Race-wise, 4 and 5, Charles ahead. Couldn't really keep the pace with those ahead, but was in and around it, was in touching distance, and just one of those things. The Red Bull's too fast. The McLaren was quite click in Lando's hands today, especially after the one stop. But we go on to Red Bull now. Another plain, simple, easy weekend. Despite failure in the rain to qualify on pole, Max Verstappen had a car which was miles quicker than anybody else at points. During the sprint race, he was 1.5 seconds quicker than the next fastest car. Again, in the race, there was times he was 1.5, 2 seconds quicker than the next car behind him, and it was 7 or 8 tenths quicker than Perez at times, and they're in the same car, which is one of the reasons why I don't think Perez really deserves that seat. Obviously, they got in the sprint. In the sprint, Perez finished P2. No, not P2, P3, and then P2 in the main race. Good performance from Perez by Perez's standards, but for me, awful performance in the grand scheme of things. They should be finishing 1-2 every weekend with the car advantage they have. You can let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I've been having a discussion with someone who I believe, I'm guessing he's a Max fan. I believe by his username, he must be from the Netherlands, Holland. I'm not quite sure what it's called by people that live there, sort of thing. He seems to think Max Verstappen's are great and should be on the list. And for me, I think there's a lot of context to be added to that. When you've got a car with such an advantage, which realistically never really happens. Obviously, don't get me wrong, Mercedes had their advantage, but it was one of those where the Mercedes wasn't guaranteed to be fastest every weekend. Ferrari were up there, Red Bull were up there still. Even in Red Bull's worst days, there was tracks where they were the quickest car, and this is what I can't really put Max on that greatest of all time list just yet. I personally think that Max has had the easiest time of any world champion, in line with Michael Schumacher. Obviously, Schumacher had the second driver clauses in the contracts, which meant he obviously got priority, and they'd have to let him past and things like that. Now, does Max have that? I don't know, but obviously that Red Bull team is purely built around Max. The car is built for Max, around Max. You can dispute it, argue it as much as you want, but the facts are there. The proof's in the pudding, really. Max has had no real competition internally, externally. Probably since, 2021, he's not had competition now in 2021. People will argue the Mercedes was faster, but when you win 8 out of the first 13, 14 races, it's not really, is it? Obviously, 2 wins off the back of poor race direction, which we have to deal with at this point, but it's just one of those things. It's probably going to end his time at Red Bull with like 90, 95 wins, 5 championships. If he doesn't have 90 plus wins by the end of 2025, something has gone horribly wrong. 5 championships as well. If he doesn't have 5 championships, then there's been a massive problem. Obviously, there's been talk about him moving to Mercedes and things like that. Can't personally see that happening until at least the end of 2026. Obviously, even potential with Ferrari and things like that coming into the equation, because obviously Lewis Hamilton's got a 2+1 at Ferrari, so be interesting to see how that situation is handled and where Ferrari are in the new regulations. But we really have to have a talk about that and how easy it is for them. Obviously, Mercedes, don't get me wrong, yes, they had dominant years, but they were never this dominant, in my opinion. Obviously, 14, 15, they had 2 teammates battling it out both years, and 16, in fact. Obviously, 17, 18, 19, you had Ferrari. Obviously, 19, I think, was the year where Ferrari had the engine situation where they went from being challengers to nowhere. Obviously, 2020 was a year where Hamilton ran away with it. Can't deny that. But 21, big rule changes. A lot of this talk has to be about rule changes because Mercedes have faced loads of them when they were at the front, and we've not had any performance-based rule changes since the beginning of these regs 3 seasons ago. And I think really it's got a lot to do with the relationship between the FIA and Red Bull. We've heard Ben Sulayem talking about how he's the only friend of Red Bull and Christian Horner, and it's things like that which, for me, cause problems. And I think the biggest problem of all is the cost cap and the development opportunities that teams have, which are limited. For me, in history, you could spend what you want, do what you want. And don't get me wrong, it meant teams ended up in financial difficulty. Of course it did. At the end of the day, life, it happens. But to be the best, you have to be able to spend, you have to be able to do trial and error. And I'm not saying that teams shouldn't be capped on what they're spending or what they're doing. I just think it's way too restrictive right now. I think the budget should be, the budget cap should be upwards of 500 million rather than, I think it's 148, I think, at the moment. I don't think they should be restricted on what they do in the wind tunnel or what they do CFD wise. I think teams should be able to do what they want. And I think that's something which has to be added into the conversation about Max Verstappen and his championships. Obviously, he's in an era where it's much harder to catch up because you don't have the opportunities to catch up. You don't have the money to spend. You don't have the development opportunities. And for me, no champion has had it easier. I think if he ends up with 7, 8 championships, which if Red Bull continue in the way they're going and build a good engine for 2026, it's possible. I think anybody who denies that is a bit stupid, really. But if he does end up with 7 or 8 championships, then the conversation has to be had of, is he really the greatest of all time? Because he's in the most restrictive era. He's built what? He's going to end up with 5 championships in the most restrictive area of Formula 1. And that's a conversation which needs to be had, in my opinion. You can let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I've got mine, you've got yours. I'm happy to have discussions, and I will reply to every single comment. So let me know your thoughts down there. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We'll be back for a Miami preview in a couple of weeks' time. And if you're interested in football, I've got loads of football content coming. So make sure you've hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and I'll catch you in the next video. Make sure to go and find me on TikTok, pictured here, and Twitter, pictured here. These are the places where I'll keep you all up to date with all my upcoming videos and my thoughts and feelings around the Formula 1 and football weekend.